Hi, I'm Dan Paasche. Welcome to Model Building. Today I'm going to repaint some N-scale equipment into a freelance paint scheme that I first came up with many years ago. Back in the early 1980s, I was modeling a freelance N-scale railroad called the North Coast. My railroad had nothing to do with the real North Coast that briefly operated part of the former Northwestern Pacific in Northern California a couple years later. My interest changed over the years and I moved on, repainting and repurposing much of the equipment. When I started building our N-scale Siren Creek project layout, though, my interest in the North Coast was rekindled. I needed a freelanced coastal standard gauge railroad, and it just fit. Even though I intend to use mostly steam power on the Siren Creek, I thought that the North Coast could use a couple of diesels. This is an old photo of one of my North Coast RS3s. Unfortunately, I don't have that locomotive anymore, but I do have a couple other diesels that I'd like to paint in the same scheme. These N-scale locomotives are both by Atlas. A few years ago I painted them for a project layout that never came to fruition and one that I no longer have any interest in. The one that's taken apart is a GP7 and the other is an SD7. I also have a microtrains Caboose. The Caboose was originally painted in my North Coast scheme as number 783 before I repainted it a second time. Now I want to restore it. At one time I had three North Coast Cabooses, 781, 782, and 783. I don't have any pictures of 783, but it was painted the same as 781 without the safety slogan. I've since repainted 781 and 782 in Southern Pacific colors. Restoring 783 to its original freelance paint scheme will be something new for me. I've never painted a model, repainted it again, and then repainted it a third time to put it back the way it was. My goals for this episode are to strip the old paint from the locomotive and caboose shells, repaint the models in North Coast colors, and apply decals. Before I repaint these models, I have to get rid of the old paint. I'm going to use my Paasche Air Eraser to remove the paint. It looks a little like an airbrush, but it shoots aluminum oxide particles which remove the paint but won't hurt the details on the shell. Removing paint this way is a little tedious, but when it's done, the shell looks like this. Most plastic that's been painted and stripped is not going to look pristine like a fresh, undecorated model. It's normal for some areas to be tinted and discolored. The important thing is that the majority of the paint is gone, as well as decals and anything else that would show through a new coat of paint. On commercial models, it's especially important to remove lettering, which is usually printed on and has thickness. Areas where two colors come together are also important to remove, otherwise the color seam can show. I'm also using an air eraser on the microtrains Caboose end railings. It's very difficult to get paint to adhere to the slick plastic. The air eraser will roughen the surface slightly, and after that it will hold paint much better. You can see the difference in this picture as the stock one is glossy and the one that I've air erased is dull. After washing the plastic shells and letting them dry overnight, they're ready for primer. Since the locomotives will be black, I'm using Tamiya light gray fine surface primer. I don't usually like rattle can paint, but the Tamiya primer goes on super thin. It produces a finish similar to an airbrush. The Caboose will be red, so I'm using Tamiya white primer. I'll set the shells aside to dry overnight. The North Coast diesel scheme is overall black with silver ends. Normally I paint the light colors first, but silver is a special case. I've had issues with masking tape marring the finish of silver paint. Thankfully, silver covers really well, so I'm going to spray the black first. I'm airbrushing the locomotives with Testor's Model Master Engine Black acrylic, thinned with Windex. After leaving the paint to dry overnight, I can mask the ends of the locomotives. I use blue painter's tape for masking. There are two tricks to avoid paint bleeding under the tape, ruining the nice sharp color separation. The first is to make sure the tape is really stuck to all the nooks and crannies. I use my fingernail to seal the tape to the model. The second trick is to apply light coats. A light, thin coat of paint will set very quickly, drying almost as soon as it hits the model. Dry paint can't creep under the tape. You want to avoid putting on a lot of wet paint all at once, as it will build up along the edge of the tape. Capillary action will try to draw it in, and that can ruin the finish on the model. I think these came out pretty well. I'm also airbrushing a BLMA sunshade set black. I'll put these on the locomotives later on. The North Coast Caboose scheme is red with a black roof. I painted the Testor's Caboose red acrylic first, then masked the parts and sprayed the black. Now that all the parts are painted, I've sprayed them with some microgloss. A glossy surface works much better with decals than a matte surface. I'm doing these models the same old school way that I did back in the 80s, using stripes and alphabet decals. I'll cut the decals on a piece of plate glass. Then I'll dribble a few drops of water on them. I'll brush some microset onto the model. Microset is a wetting agent. It goes on before the decal and helps to lubricate the decal and make it easier to get into position. After the decals have soaked for a while, I can transfer them to the model. If they start to stick too soon, I can apply some more microset. A straight edge is useful to help line them up. Once I'm happy with the positioning, I'll apply some microsol. Microsol softens the decals and helps them to conform to the surface of the model. Don't attempt to move the decal after applying microsol. I do the stripes on the locomotives one at a time. Getting the first one aligned can take some doing. I use a straight edge in my eye to make sure it's straight. Measuring the distance between the bottom of the shell and the stripe on both ends of the model helps to make sure that the stripe is level. After I've used microsol to get the first stripe permanently attached, I'll repeat the process for the second stripe. I'm paying particular attention to the width of the black gap between the stripes. This needs to be as uniform as possible and the same width as the black pinstriping that I'll use on the ends. For the road name, I'll cut out individual letters from an alphabet sheet. Sometimes consecutive letters can be used to save some effort, like the NO and the ST. If I were planning to do more than a couple units, I'd look into having decals printed. I keep the decals moist with microset while coaxing them into position. I take my time here to make sure everything lines up as it should. As with other decals, I'll apply microsol once I'm satisfied with the positioning. In order to make sure that the stripes over the cab sides line up with those on the locomotive body, I've temporarily reassembled the models. On both engines, the cab numbers are being stubborn, with persistent bubbles and silvering. I'll poke the decals gently but repeatedly with a sharp X-Acto blade and then apply some more microsol. Eventually they will settle down. Incidentally, a while ago I rediscovered a complete locomotive roster for my fictitious North Coast that I probably put together back in the 80s or 90s. I used this to pick the locomotive numbers. Once the decals are done, I rinse off the model in clean water and then spray it with a clear flat overcoat. Rinsing will remove any residue left over from the microsol and microset. This is the Caboose body after sealing the decals with some Tester's dull coat. The clear coat protects the decals and helps to hide the decal film. Before reassembling the Caboose, I put a 1/4 ounce stick-on weight on the floor. I'll finish up by highlighting some of the handrails and grab irons in white paint. This Caboose has the Microtrains window glazing kit installed. I also replaced the plastic wheels with metal ones from Fox Valley. I painted the wheel faces brown. This model's restoration is now finished. The red is brighter than the Caboose's in my old photos, but I think the new red looks better. I'm not sure what paint I used way back then, and I rarely bothered with primer in those days. I also used to weather everything with dark gray washes, which I've gotten away from because it was too heavy-handed for my tastes. Other than that, the only change I made to the original paint scheme is the small NCC reporting mark. I found out that NC has been used as a reporting mark, but as best as I can determine, NCC hasn't. So it officially stands for North Coast Railway Company. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. I've coated the finished locomotive shells with dull coat as well. Since it's easier to do now before I reassemble the shells, I'll put a light coat of black weathering powder on the door seams. I'm aiming for subtle. Our N-scale Siren Creek layout is set in the 1950s when these locomotives would have been new. They should be fairly clean. I'll use some white paint to highlight the corner handrails. Then I'll use some dark brown powder on the walkways. This shot shows how I used black pinstripe decals to make it look like the silver stripes continue across the ends of the locomotives. I used red pinstriping and silver barricade stripes to finish off the sills and pilots. With the shells reassembled, I think they look pretty good. This paint scheme was always a lot of work, which is why I never painted too many engines like this. I really like it though, and it's a huge improvement over the purple scheme that was on them before. I'm going to leave them like this for the time being, as I want to install sound decoders before I put the models back together. I'll cover that in a future episode. Repainting equipment in an old unwanted paint scheme is an alternative to selling it off or just storing it unused. Using models that I already had saved me from having to buy new models to make some trains for my fictitious railroad. Alphabet sheet and striping decals, along with a dose of creativity, are great for freelance paint schemes. Using decals can save a lot of work masking and painting. My diesel scheme borrows elements from SP's Black Widow scheme, Santa Fe's Zebra Stripe scheme, and Southern Railway's Black and White scheme. To me anyway, it looks like something that could have existed. And the classic red Caboose just looks right. Having a scheme that looks plausible makes a freelanced railroad seem more believable. I'm really happy with the way the equipment turned out. The Caboose is finished, but the engine still needs sound decoders, so I'll be covering that in a future episode. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.